You need solutions. You can't say to people you can't have a burger. You can't fight big food producers by regulating against them. You've got to give consumers what they want.
Welcome to Glasgow, coming to you from the COP26. I'm speaking with Jeremy Collar of Collar Capital, but more importantly, you're here in a different context. You're here to talk about FAIR, to talk about agriculture, to talk about the end of factory farming and how that is actually good for all of the things and the ambitions that people are trying to achieve here. Talk about FAIR. What's the idea here?
FAIR stands for Farm Animal Investment Risk and Return, and investors are now seeing the investment risks in food, whether it's in antibiotics and class actions that can come from with restaurants. 80% of antibiotics in the US are used on factory farms, and investors are now concerned that there could be class actions with
So it's
restaurants.
become an ESG question, but
It
it
is an
also
ESG.
aligns with the E part of it, the environmental part of it, in the sense that I think is the emissions from methane emissions from farm animals and livestock happens to be one of the biggest polluters or creators of greenhouse gases.
More than the whole transport sector, plane, trains and automobiles. 30% of methane comes from agriculture, 30% of methane comes from fossil fuels. You either have to get rid of all fossil fuels to get below the 30%. The 30%
Which is the target that they came up with many of the big countries.
Or you have to get rid of all livestock production, so obviously
But Jeremy, nobody's talking about that. I mean, you don't get a sense that here at the COP that people are talking about reduction, a few people about reduction in livestock or meat or factory farming. It seems to be a little bit of like a third rail for politicians.
I think because they're so concerned about they're just calling them out a little bit. It's been too hot a political potato to deal with.
Well, nobody wants to be told. Nobody wants to be the politician that tells someone, "Look, you really shouldn't eat burgers," or you really need to reduce your chicken consumption.
No, and telling someone that they have to eat carrots it's very difficult for all of us.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming off it as an ESG principle, but there is a new revolution happening, which is a food tech revolution. Alternative proteins is growing in popularity. 10% of burgers from Burger King are now plant impossible,
Right?
And in their sales in the US. This food tech revolution will lead to a just transition for meat eaters.
Well, you say it that way. A just transition to meat eaters doesn't sound so bad, right? It's sort of that's a way to address this issue. Of course, you have the other question of farmers, and one of the reasons politicians are so afraid of touching this issue is because what do you do with farmers? What do you do with those farmers that people write about or we profile on television? They say,
exactly.
well, I no longer can pay for my farm because people stopped eating meat. You don't want to be that politician.
No, and this is mainly Big Ag, which are addressing it. So Tyson's have changed their strapline. They're now a protein producer. They're not a meat processor.
So food tech, let's put on your investment hat, of course, because you've invested in some companies. You as someone who's been a vegetarian or vegan for most of
Since
your
I'm
life,
12.
right? So this is a passion for you anyway. But and most of your day-to-day work is as an investor in private equity, essentially. Yeah. But you've also made some pretty interesting investments in food tech. No? What's your best one?
Well, there's a range because there's Beyond Impossible.
You invest in Beyond.
Yes. But the reason I did it was because you need solutions. You can't say to people you can't have a burger. You can't fight big food producers by regulating against them, or taxing.
Yeah.
You've got to give consumers what they want, and farmers are so important, and there are great farmers, both in the UK, everywhere. There are great farmers, but this is not what this is about. A just transition for farmers. A lot of farmers want to change the way they do their work, and governments have a responsibility to help with that transition. It's just as important.
So it's once providing the alternative, as you say, so it's not the Impossible Burger or whatever it might be, is the one for the consumer. So you're not, and then on the other hand, making sure that doesn't damage the
farmers, and I think that's the biggest issue for in politics, because obviously agriculture is a large part of every country.
So if you can't get agriculture to be the biggest slot in the agenda here at COP26, there is, of course, next year, COP27, no?
COP27. So on the 9th and 10th of November 2022, we are calling for Climate Food Summit at COP27, 2 days focused on that, focused on climate and food, because it is that important, and very importantly for investors, which now have engaged on over 45 trillion, as I mentioned, are networked into doing research and engaging on the material investment risks. And let me just give you an example of one. If you're 80% of antibiotics in the US are used on factory farms. Now, if you're a restaurant chain and like McDonald's, etc., and you don't look at your antibiotics use, which they do, by the way, then you could be subject to class actions. You could be subject to regulators like California, which just banned the last year the everyday use of antibiotics. These are investment risks, and we need to know. We need a clear path to what regulations, law we can abide by as investors. We need a playing field.
So this will be the big.
So we're calling on COP to actually have a little bit of courage and address food, because it's.
No, absolutely. It hits all the right points. Thank you, Jeremy. I'll see you in, I guess, Cairo next year.
I'll see you in Cairo.